My name, for those who don't know, is Juan McCartney. I'm the Corporate and Consumer Relations Manager here at the Utilities Regulation and Competition Authority. We regulate the electronic communications sector as well as the energy sector, and that is a wide encompassing area of sectors that we regulate. So many things fall into it. One of those things would be the electronic communications sector, as I said, and the director of the electronic communications sector here at URCA is Mr. Rupert Pinder. And so, Rupert, thank you for joining us today here on URCA 360. We really appreciate your participation in helping us to bring some more clarity to what URCA does. So one of the reasons for having this podcast is to better educate the public about URCA. There are many facets to URCA, but as I said, there are two main sectors that we're regulating, and yours is the electronic communications sector. So why don't you explain to us a bit about what the scope of that entails as far as electronic communications and what that means for the average everyday citizen?
Okay, so thank you very much, Juan. I'm delighted to be here this morning with you. So for the regulation of the electronic communications sector, as you can appreciate, so we regulate in terms of the communication service provider. So the major providers are, i.e., the Bahamas Telecommunications Company Limited, BTC, Alive, Cable Bahamas Limited. So those are our major licensees, and of course the radio broadcasters. And we're also responsible for the management of spectrum, right? So, and spectrum, as you can appreciate, is a national asset. And that is an asset that is managed by URCA on the electronic communications side.
So if we're talking electronic communications, we're talking television, we're talking internet, not so much internet as in what you see on the internet, but the provision of internet. We're talking cell phones, we're talking fixed line mobile phones, we're talking pay phones, even though they hardly exist, right? We're talking radio communications, such as radio frequencies that they would use at the airports, that they would use in private communications companies, et cetera. And we're even talking fixed broadband, such as satellite provision. And when you talk about spectrum, it's such a wide-ranging area of things that are covered in spectrum, spectrum being our national airwaves. And so we essentially regulate that. And under that falls so many different services. So the question, I think, the first comes to mind is, why do we need someone to regulate that?
Well, very good question that you would ask. Well, one of the things to bear in mind is that certainly not at risk of becoming overly technical, but one of the things to bear in mind is that regulation is what we call in economics, it's really a surrogate for competition, right? So it's in the absence of effective competition, you have to introduce by way of regulation. As you can appreciate, that's one of the dynamics in operating in a very small market, the absence of effective competition. And of course, competition produces a lot by way of the welfare for consumers. So in other words, it improves the lives for consumers. So to the extent to which you have more competition in the market, you have lower prices, more choices. All of that comes by way of the introduction of competition in the market, right? Or part of what we consider to be the liberalization process. And I think perhaps a very good example of that, and perhaps an untold story, I think, in terms of URCA's remit and its overall activities, is that certainly we would look in terms of what is happening with respect to the provision of cellular mobile services. So today we have two very active competitors in the market in the form of BTC and Alive. And what you would have seen as a result in terms of the liberalization in that particular space is that now today you're talking about lower prices. So for example, as recent as maybe 7 years ago, maybe 6, 7 years ago, you were talking about on average about 37 cents per minute in terms of the effective price for a prepaid call per minute, right? Now today, given in terms of all of the bundles that you're seeing, you're talking about maybe mere pennies, or in some cases a fraction of a penny, depending on the plan that you have. And so all of those are the benefit in terms of more competition within the market.
Mm-hmm. Before we get into any other sectors, let's stick with the mobile service providers for a moment and talk about the regulatory aspects of that. One of the things that's very important to URCA and is a part of the Communications Act is that we have a good quality of service for consumers throughout the country. Now, I think one of the things that goes unappreciated is that for the Bahamas in particular, this is sometimes extremely difficult to monitor because we have at least 22 inhabited islands, and there is a standard that is expected to be maintained for all the populations on all those islands, when oftentimes there's not really a business case for these mobile providers to invest the way they should in these islands. So how does URCA guarantee, or to the best of its ability, ensure that there's a uniform quality of service throughout the Bahamas? Because we know that that's a challenge.
Well, very good point again, and that is covered by way of universal service obligations. So as part of the universal service obligation is to ensure that you put in place in terms of the minimum standards, in terms of quality, in terms of access to these communication services throughout the island. So, for example, somebody on the island of Crooked Island should be able to get the same standard of service as somebody on the island of New Providence, right? And so you have to have that broader consistency, irrespective, in this case, in terms of the level of investment. Now, one of the things here is that you have the universal service obligation, which imposes those obligations on the licensees. The other aspect of it, which we'll be consulting on very shortly as part of that overall framework, is the funding mechanism. So you have, and I don't want to say too much at this time, because obviously that is subject to a public consultation, and you don't want to necessarily bias or prejudice the process one way or the other. But the funding mechanism is what we'll be looking at in terms of how you fund some of those universal service obligations for the very same reasons that you've outlined. The reality of it here is that for the licensees, there is more of a compelling business case for the provision of certain services on the island of New Providence and Grand Bahama, and perhaps less so in some of the other islands. But from a regulatory standpoint, we have to stand in the gap and to ensure that persons in these other islands also have access to these services.
So let's talk for a second about broadband, which is really where the world has gone in terms of using data, in terms of access to the internet and the Internet of Things. And we have essentially two large broadband providers, and then we have some other players in the market. We had a forum last year on digital transformation. BTC made the case that fiber really is the future, and we see that Cable Bahamas is expanding into fiber as well with Alive. On Grand Bahama, we see that there's a rapid progression of fiber throughout that island. There's a rapid progression of fiber throughout New Providence. The issue with fiber is that it's more expensive than your traditional copper networks, and so again, business case scenarios maybe not as likely in the Family Islands. What other sorts of technologies are there that are emerging that do form some sort of competition and really also provision of services that people can look to URCA to regulate and kind of watch for?
But one of the things, as you can appreciate, is that the regime itself is really technology neutral, right? And what that really means here is that URCA doesn't necessarily regulate in terms of the choice of technology by the licensees. I mean, that is really in terms of a commercial undertaking. What we seek to do is to ensure that the quality of service that they deliver, is to an acceptable standard, right? And so that is and so they would make those business case in terms of
what they use,
or the choice of technology. Now, and again, just perhaps a pointed elephant in the room. There's been a lot of discussion, let's say, around 5G, and some of the more advanced technologies. Again, if by way of the sector policy, if the government wants to move, let's say, in a direction in terms of wanting to see some of these technologies, et cetera, I mean, that can be obviously enunciated by way of the sector policy. But generally speaking, in terms of the regulatory framework itself is really technology neutral, to give the licensees that flexibility in terms of making it a commercial decision in terms of their choice of technology. What we care about is really in terms of the quality of service.
Quality of service. I guess what I was more getting at was the competition aspect,
yes,
as opposed to the actual regulation of any sort of technology. So to the extent that URCA believes and has advised the government that there's not room now for a third mobile operator to provide more of those services that might perhaps cover other areas. URCA has also licensed other entities that provide technology, low Earth orbit, satellites, et cetera. Do you feel as though that sort of competition is healthy for the Bahamas and that it can aid in more of the universal service obligations as far as broadband is concerned?
Well, certainly, and I don't want to necessarily say a lot at this time with respect to universal service obligation, because again, I mean, that's
Something we're looking at.
something by way of the consultative process. But in other countries, let's put it this way, in other jurisdictions, I mean, there is the potential, right? And I think it's fair to say, I mean, there is the potential in terms of looking at other licensees in terms of how you fulfill in terms of some of the universal service obligations. So, for example, and this is more or less in terms of a theoretical sort of discussion. I mean, yes, it's pragmatic, but at the same time, we don't know in terms of how we're going to align with respect to universal service obligation framework. But bearing in mind, I mean, there are different options in terms of to designate universal service provider, et cetera. So it doesn't necessarily mean in some models that it could be BTC and or CBL or some of the major licenses. It could very well be that a smaller licensee can also step in and fulfill part of that obligation, perhaps on the part of another licensee, to the extent to which you put in place, let's say, a funding mechanism. And so, therefore, if somebody can do it more efficiently, they can access, the funds by way of the funding mechanism. But again, those are various models that are out there, but and all of those will be explored in the context of the consultation. But on the question of Starlink, right, or in terms of low orbit satellite providers, and let's call it for what it is in terms of the, I guess your reference here in terms of the Starlink. Starlink was licensed to provide fixed broadband services. And I know there have been a lot of discussions in terms of what they were licensed to provide, et cetera, and I think that need to be made very clear. They were licensed to provide fixed broadband services, in other words, broadband at a fixed location. Having said that, what exists already is that there's already a framework in place in terms of the treatment of broadband connectivity services. That is a service that is already provided in a liberalized market, right? So that is provided in a competitive market. We have any number of licensees that are providing broadband services. And yes, Starlink, I think, in my view, provides the kind of competitive dynamics that we would like to see in the broadband space.
So let's talk 5G for a moment. I know you had referenced it before, and given the fact that we are technology neutral, I think there is just no avoiding where the world is headed with that. And URCA has done some work with it, and we're planning on doing some more work. So could you kind of explain where we've gotten to so far and where it is that we look to be going?
Okay, so last year we completed the first phase of the work stream, which was to focus on the demand side. In other words, we did the surveys to ascertain in terms of whether or not there were use cases in terms of the 5G services. And again, it's to inform the relative, the appropriate stakeholders, et cetera, in terms of what was there by way of use cases. And the approach that we've taken is an approach that you will see in some other jurisdictions in terms of assessing in terms of the use case. In 2024, what we're embarking on is what is known as the supply side framework. In other words, we're putting in place in terms of the regulatory framework, should a licensee wish today to provide 5G services, we would have we're developing a framework that would allow them, that would speak to issues such as, for example, the spectrum requirements, if there are any requirements there in terms of network sharing, all of those, and then of course, an issue that is increasingly getting a lot of attention is also in terms of cybersecurity. So these are all, and how can I forget infrastructure sharing regulations as well? Because because when you increase in terms of the intensity, in terms of the number of antennas that are required as part of the provision of 5G services, again, you have to revisit the perhaps in terms of infrastructure sharing regulations. And so when you look in terms of the range of issues, it's really our approach is really to ensure that the framework is in place to allow the licensees to have the flexibility to make the appropriate commercial decision.
So I'll ask you a more perhaps esoteric question. Artificial intelligence, that's on everybody's mind. It's something that's here. It is being used in a lot of countries in a very effective way. To the extent that people understand it, to the extent that people understand the use cases for it, I don't know that we're there yet in the Bahamas, and we need a lot more public education on it. But it's something that would not only be regulated by an URCA, but URCA would certainly play a part in it. So where do you see URCA in terms of looking at artificial intelligence and how it's employed and deployed in the Bahamas?
Well, one of the approaches that we have taken so far, with respect to the AI, and you mentioned in terms of the education part of it, is certainly in terms of doing appropriate research, right? And we've been attending any number of forums dealing specifically in terms of the AI. But I think that there are a number of moving parts, a number of applications, and we are certainly doing the appropriate research.
Yeah, particularly given that a lot of the use cases for AI requires the use of spectrum and a lot of different sorts of technologies. URCA would certainly play a role in looking at the regulation of that.
Yeah, there's no question, but then of course, as you can appreciate, while there are any number of developments that are out there, not everything necessarily lends itself to regulatory intervention, right? And so in some cases, for lack of a better word, some cases the best regulation is really no regulation. It depends, right? And so again, it's really understanding the remit of URCA with respect to this overall development, and then also understanding, and I think what's also very important here, in terms of understanding the overall remit. And while a lot of these things obviously impact in terms of communication services, there's also broader policy type questions as well. So you also have to look in terms of interaction, in terms of where you remit, et cetera, and then where there's involvement in terms of a wider public policy, and also to the extent to which you have those interaction at those levels to ensure that you have effective regulation.
Got it. Last question I'll ask you. URCA's mission is improving lives through effective utilities regulation. How can URCA be more effective? How can URCA be more effective in regulation in the area of electronic communications?
Well, one of the things I think that we can be more effective, I think we need to certainly ensure that we have more collaboration with all of our stakeholders. So on my last point I mentioned in terms of the public policy element. So the government is very big. It's a big stakeholder there in terms of the public policy dimension. There's also in terms of the licenses, right? Because while we're not here to provide any by way of protectionist policy, it's in nobody's interest to the extent to which the licensees, that you don't have sustainable competition, right? And because sustainable competition inure to the benefits of consumers. And finally, listening to the consumers, right, and ensure that their interest is protected. So it's really in terms of a balance beam that one has to walk.
Excellent. Thank you, Rupert. We certainly hope this won't be the last time you'll be joining us on URCA 360, but it's good to get some insight into what it is that the electronic communications sector of URCA actually does, and we appreciate your time today.
Thank you for having me.